All right, we should begin. Good evening. My name is Nick Bisley, and I'm the Dean of Humanities and Social Sciences at La Trobe University and also a member of China Matters Advisory Board. And I'd like to welcome you all to this evening, which is a sort of double bill. In one sense, it's the Australian launch of Brendan Taylor's latest Adelphi book, Dangerous Decade, Taiwan Security and Crisis Management. But it's also, more importantly, a panel discussion about the substance of the book, about Taiwan's future and the prospect of a security crisis in the region. And I should emphasise that this evening is very much a joint production of the Coral Bell School of Asia-Pacific Affairs at the ANU and China Matters. To begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're gathered, the Dagunawal people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, to celebrate their enduring connection to country and recognise the sovereignty of the land was never ceded. Now, the aim of this evening is to have a robust debate about Taiwan's future and the prospects of a strategic crisis emerging on this kind of most original of Cold War flashpoints. The catalyst to the discussion is, of course, Brendan's book, but it's important, I think, to have this conversation because with the surfeit of security and strategic crises in the region, North Korea, South China Sea, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, to name but four, it's easy to overlook Taiwan. I think, indeed, some rather complacently feel that one of the major, some complacently feel that of the major fronts for potential conflict or crisis in the region, it is the one that appears to be actually in the best shape. And yet Brendan begs to differ with this received wisdom. Not only has Taiwan become more fraught in recent years than many may think, in his view, it is entering an extremely dangerous period. So let me just briefly begin by describing the structure of the evening and then introduce our panellists and then we'll begin. So we'll open things up with me talking a little bit to Brendan about the book, draw out the central arguments, get him to sort of put his cards on the table, if you like, about his proposition. And then I'll draw out the panellists to prod and poke some of these ideas. And with some luck, and indeed I'm pretty confident given the personalities that we have up here, they will have what is in Canberra known as, I understand, a full and frank conversation. Then I'll open things up to questions from the floor. There will be a couple of roving mics, so when the time comes and I call you, wait for the mic to get to you, and the usual instructions apply. Keep them short, keep them questions, and we'll get hopefully through a good round. Now, our panellists are all renowned, and indeed, I think, very well known to many of you, so I'll keep my comments fairly brief introducing them. Brendan Taylor is, of course, the star attraction with his book, and he's Professor of Strategic Studies and Deputy Director of the Coral Bell School, and is also an Associate of China Matters. Linda Jacobsen is the Co-Chair and Founding Director of China Matters, an independent policy institute focused on the tough policy issues in the China-Australia relationship, which by my reckoning is probably just about all of them at this point in time. Hugh White is Emeritus Professor of Strategic Studies. That adjective at the start I still find a little peculiar.
Very important.
And has a list of careers prior to joining SDSC that's as long as one could imagine: intelligence analyst, journalist, ministerial advisor. But I think his most important role in recent years has been to be the permanent irritant of Greg Sheridan and the subject of many an opinion piece. And Hugh is also, like me, a member of the China Matters Advisory Council. Finally, Alan Gyngell is the director of the Crawford Australian Leadership Forum at the ANU and a professor at... No? My notes are live. So in two different ways, we'll probably be pursued by the ACCC for misleading and deceptive conduct. I'm fairly confident that Alan is an adjunct professor, though, at the ANU Crawford School of Public Policy, unless he's had his adjunct status removed, which may have occurred. One thing that I can say with 100% confidence, though, is that he is a member of the China Matters Board of Directors.
Yeah.
1 out of 3, that's where we begin. So let's start with Brendan, as promised. Why is it that we think that the Taiwan problem isn't the sort of problem that we used to? Why aren't the risks of conflict over Taiwan taken with the seriousness with which we ought to take them?
Well, I mean, it's a really good question to start off on, and I think you foreshadowed it in your opening remarks. Partly there's a lot of competition for that kind of label out there with all of the other tensions and flashpoints in Asia and beyond. at the moment. But I think that there are some deeper reasons than that. I think in some ways we're in a bit of denial. I think we reassure ourselves about the possibility of major power conflict in Asia and in the world. And I think we think to ourselves, surely this just couldn't happen today in a world with nuclear weapons, in a globalised world, a world with a lot of very tight economic interdependency. Surely major power war, any rational person wouldn't go to war, and given the costs involved. I think we're also complacent in a sense of denial about China's military power and how fast and how far that's come within a very short space of time. I think we're in denial about the fact, for instance, that the Chinese Navy is now bigger than the US Navy, that 70% of that Navy, of China's Air Force, is now classified as modern. Now, that's not to say that it's at a point now where it's necessarily overtaken the United States. I don't think it has, but I think we're in denial about some of the shifts that are happening in our region and in the world. But I think the thing that worries me most of all is I think there's a sense of complacency that because of all these tensions that you mentioned, there's been a series of mini crises, and one, in fact, on the Korean Peninsula that I think has been something more than a mini crisis. I think came quite close to conflict in 2017 and could potentially be heading in that direction again. And I think that we look at those crises and think, well, we managed to muddle our way through those crises. We'll be able to do that again. That old Australian saying, she'll be right. I think there's that sense of complacency as well. And the thing that really worries me is if you look back over history at the really big conflicts that have occurred, even going right back to the Peloponnesian Wars 2,500 years ago, but particularly the First World War and the Second World War, we saw a very similar dynamic at play where we saw a series of crises that were kind of muddled through and without the underlying causes of those crises being resolved. And eventually there was an event that kind of triggered a kind of a conflagration that brought the whole system kind of tumbling down. So that's the thing that worries me about this particular flashpoint. I think that has the potential to be that kind of trigger that kind of brings the whole system down in a similar way to what those past crises have done.
So the Taiwan status has been contested since 1949, but over recent years, as you're alluding to, there's been a kind of status quo for managing this, and we've established a sort of diplomatic and strategic kind of equilibrium of sorts. And in the book, what you trace out is essentially this coming to an end. So if you could quickly sort of sketch out what was the kind of status quo and why is it unravelling?
Yeah. Well, the status quo, it's a very vague concept. It's a very informal concept. It's not written down between the key players. It's really a set of informal or tacit understandings between those, the three main parties to this flashpoint, the United States, mainland China and Taiwan. And I think from Taiwan's perspective, for a long time, Taiwan has been willing to live with the idea of being something short of a state, recognising that to come out and formally declare independence would be too provocative for the mainland. I think the mainland, as part of the status quo, has been willing to not attack Taiwan, largely because it realises that it just doesn't have that capacity. Even as recently as 20 years ago, the Chinese Navy and Air Force was arguably even weaker than Taiwan's Air Force, something that's kind of amazing to think about today. And I think the United States kind of played the role of almost a balancer between those two actors. On the one hand, dissuading Taiwan from declaring independence by saying, well, we might be there to support you, but we might not. And on doing the same thing in a very ambiguous way to the mainland as well, saying, well, if you do attack Taiwan, we might be there to support Taiwan. And I think that what's happened over the last few years is that we've seen that status quo shifting as Taiwan, I think, for very, very understandable reasons, a growing proportion of the population on Taiwan, many of whom have never lived on the mainland, don't really have much affinity with the mainland. They see themselves now a clear majority of Taiwan's population see their own identity, view their own identity as being exclusively Taiwanese. And I think in some respects, Xi Jinping sees the writing on the wall here. I think that when he says, this is an issue that can't be passed from generation to generation, I think that he realises if this issue is passed from generation to generation, it's going to end up in a place where Taiwan does whether by accident or design, end up essentially as an independent state. So I think that's why we see a sense of urgency in some of Xi's statements, particularly over the past couple of years, and also in kind of the intensification of Chinese coercion towards Taiwan. And then I think in the United States we see a US that is unpredictable in some respects because of the leadership, but I think that also recognises that its grip on this flashpoint is beginning to slip, partly because of the shift in the balance of military power between the US and China. And it realises that the window is closing on that period when it's going to be the decisive actor in this flashpoint from a military perspective. And we see a situation now where I would argue that ties between the United States and Taiwan are the closest that they've been since the height of the Cold War, when the US and Taiwan actually had a formal military alliance. And I think that that is as much a reflection of a US recognition that time is running out, and that its grip on this flashpoint is slipping.
So we've got, and I think it's really important that you draw out that it's not just bad old China that's doing things, that this is a sort of the shifting sands are a function of changes in Taiwan, changes in the US, and changes in the PRC. I think one of the most disturbing or worrying parts of the book is the scenarios that you lay out, the sort of four scenarios that flag ways in which the kind of structural crisis, if you like, gets potentially triggered into an acute problem. So there's one, red lines get drawn, and then hands are forced because of this to escalate to crisis. There's the sort of inadvertent escalation scenario. There's the third scenario of a kind of we get a new Cold War in which, as in the old Cold War, there's sort of proxy conflicts in which direct clash is avoided through indirect clashes, and Taiwan becomes a front. And then there's the sort of incentives that military technology bring to provide. Each side wants to be the one that gets in front of the sort of escalation advantage to be the one getting things moving. Each of them are worrying in different ways. Which of these do you think is most likely? And maybe talk us through that one to sort of get a sense of how this may play out in reality.
Well, the bad news is that they're all conceivable. But I think if you had to really pin me down on which is the most likely of the four, which is the greatest danger, I would go for the second one of those. That kind of idea of an inadvertent escalation, a kind of an incident that takes place at the wrong place at the wrong time and escalates into something much larger. So we've had a number of these incidents occurring in Asia over the last few years. We've had near collisions of US and Chinese ships, for instance, near collisions of Chinese and Japanese aircraft. We've even had collisions involving US and Chinese aircraft as well. So this is something that's real and is happening. We've seen these sorts of episodes occur around Taiwan as well. As recently as this year, for instance, we saw an unidentified Chinese military ship colliding with a Taiwanese freighter in the Taiwan Strait. So these episodes are happening. And some people would say, well, this happened all the time in the Cold War and it never escalated into something else. What worries me, though, about this particular situation is kind of the very strong nationalism that we see in Northeast Asia more generally, and particularly around this flashpoint. And I worry that we could see a repeat of an episode that occurred back in July of 2016, where there was a Taiwanese destroyer was parked in a Taiwanese port, the port of Kaohsiung, and accidentally fired an anti-shipping missile. That anti-shipping missile had a range of about 300 kilometres, flew in the direction of the mainland. Fortunately for everybody involved, except for the poor captain of the fishing boat, the missile collided with, impacted with a Taiwanese fishing vessel, and the captain was killed and a number of crew were injured. I worry that an episode like that, what if that had happened exactly five years to the day later on the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party in that kind of nationalistically charged atmosphere? Imagine if that missile hadn't hit a Taiwanese fishing vessel, imagine if it had hit a Chinese fishing vessel, or worse still, a Chinese military vessel. Could a situation like that have been contained? So that's where I see the dangers of a kind of something inadvertent escalating into a much larger conflict in a way that we perhaps didn't see during the Cold War period.
So what can we do about all of this? You lay out a scenario of the sort of 10 years in which these big tectonic forces are producing a long period of risk, and as you said, the sort of nationalism that's there, the wounded nationalism that's on the side of China and to some degree the United States, an emergent nationalism within Taiwan as the kerosene in all of this. What is it that can be done to, firstly, I guess, contain and corral this, or even ideally walk some of these things back?
Yes. Once again, the bad news is that there is no easy solution to this. I don't think within 10 years that this very long-standing dispute is going to be resolved. So I think the best that we can hope for, particularly during this decade when I think the chances of a conflict are going to increase, or a crisis that escalates into a conflict are going to increase. I think we can look around what's happening elsewhere in Asia, and there have been some promising developments around the East China Sea, for instance, where China and Japan, after 10 years of negotiation, have agreed to a new communication mechanism that kind of lessens the prospects of these inadvertent clashes occurring. We've seen similar things happen on the Korean Peninsula when Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un met in Pyongyang. They came up with a set of confidence-building measures that put some of these arrangements in place. Some of those have been walked away from, but some of them are still in place. So we have seen similar examples in the case of Taiwan back in September 2015 when then President Ma Ying-jeou and President Xi met in Singapore. In November of that year, they did agree to establish a hotline connecting the two sides of the strait. Unfortunately, now when the Taiwanese call that hotline, apparently the Chinese side doesn't answer the hotline after the change of government to the Tsai Ing-wen government in January of 2016. But I think that's an area where most emphasis should be being placed, trying to get those sorts of arrangements back up and running again, trying to develop much more robust mechanisms for actually managing a crisis that does occur to reduce the chances of miscalculation or misperception. I think that's the best way forward. Once again, it's not going to be an easy way. And I also think it's not something that can be just left to the United States and China and Taiwan. I think other countries that have a very big stake in this particular flashpoint, Australia, Japan, and Singapore, for instance, I think we have a role to play in this as well. And if we're going to be thinking about trying to influence Chinese policy behaviour, there's a whole range of areas in which you could try and do that. This would be the one that I'd be really zeroing in on and trying to make a difference amongst that very big suite of other issues that could be looked at.
Yeah, and I guess that also partly comes from that thing you said at the outset, which is we've got to see this as the crisis that it is and not the it's okay kind of scenario. Because that, I think when we look back at the Cold War context, one of the key reasons we managed it is everyone was acutely aware of the damn need to manage it. The stakes were so high. And I think one of the things that, as you say, is so disconcerting is the sense that the stakes aren't so high and things are, we can probably manage this one. So, Linda, now I want to turn to you and get your views, I guess, on Brendan's arguments. In particular, I want to start by asking you what your sense is of how Brendan portrays or assesses Beijing's perceptions and incentives on Taiwan, because he describes a sort of set of incentives which seems to provide encouragement for acting in the short to medium term. That's to say something that accelerates the sense of crisis. Does he get it right, or what's your view on how Beijing sees this?
Let me start by saying thank you for inviting me. I'm working on a project to do with Taiwan, so this is of great interest. I found this book, Dangerous Decade, really an excellent, balanced analysis. What pleases me is something that's already been mentioned, is that you make that terribly crucial point that we have to acknowledge that this, if anything, is a possibility of a crisis which spirals out of control into conflict. And I think especially here in Canberra, enough people don't acknowledge that. I think it's very dangerous not to acknowledge it, so that in itself makes this a really valuable contribution, this book. And you also, I think, the book makes us think not about the tipping point, but about the process which will lead to the tipping point. And I think that's also a very useful thing, especially for policymakers to start thinking about, and not focus so much on that tipping point, but how do we get there and what could be done to avert it. So those are two kind of just general comments I have about the book. To Nick's question about perceptions, I think on balance, Brendan really does get it right. I have a few comments to make. One is that I think that the division of those in Beijing who watch the Taiwan Straits issues, who are patient, and you group them into two groups, the patient group and the impatient group, or I think you say the not so patient group. I wouldn't do that. I don't think that's accurate. I was in Beijing. Obviously, this book was written before that. I was in Beijing now in September, discussing a lot about Taiwan, and I do feel that it's not that clear-cut at all, and I think Hong Kong especially has changed perceptions among those who look at the Taiwan Strait. I think the possibility of a middle-class uprising, if the mainland was to do something which went against the will of the middle-class society of Taiwanese, is something that before hasn't been really thought about and is now being contemplated. I think the Hong Kong crisis has really forced people who think about the Taiwan Strait in Beijing and about the military or coercive option, which I'll talk about in a moment, about the resolve of human beings. This has brought new thinking into Beijing's planning and willingness to walk that route. If I may, Nick, I'll say a few things about, I very much agree with Brendan that Xi Jinping is much more impatient than his predecessors. And he has made it very clear, as Brendan very clearly shows in the book, by a number of statements. But I see Xi Jinping's goal as wanting to go down in history as the man who started the political unification process. He could well accept that he won't be alive to see that, what they call reunification. So what does that mean? If he wants to be the guy who will be credited with political talks taking place, it doesn't matter if the talks then take 30 years, because in Chinese style they could. My worry, my biggest concern is possibly something that's not in the book, and that would be due to external factors, possibly domestic crisis in the PRC, possibly a domestic crisis in Taiwan in the next decade, because I very much agree with Brendan that it's the next decade which is crucial. The PRC could use all means except for war to bring the political leadership in Taiwan to its knees and force them to start negotiations. So a shot wouldn't necessarily have to be fired. So what am I thinking about? 100,000 mainland fishermen are sent over unarmed towards Taiwan. Are the Taiwanese going to slaughter 100,000 unarmed fishermen? At the same time, they take out the electricity, the communications of the Taiwanese island, and create so much havoc and anxiousness within Taiwan that the pressure builds on the political leadership. Well, we might as well talk. I mean, there's lots of other things they could do. They could put Taiwan into a partial blockade. You speak about that in the book, I think, really well. So I think there could be a crisis which mainland China could seize upon and force the political leadership to agree to talks, and Xi Jinping could come out of it saying that we have been victorious. And he could tick the box that we have already de facto started that process of reunification. And in a way, then he would leave to the next generation the actual negotiation about the details of how this is going to happen.
Linda, I wonder what your sense of the prospects of a return to the sort of long, quiet game that used to exist in Beijing. That's to say, the idea that history is on China's side, wait, time, the Marxist notion of history and all of those sorts of things mean that we don't have to do anything. Whereas what Brendan has described in the book is that's gone, and that there's this set of things that are encouraging a much more active approach. Is there any prospect of trying to be a bit more positive here? Is there any prospects of a return to that sense that history is on our side, and what's 23 million people, even if they're feeling nationalistic and feeling like they've got a nation state, we're the PRC, we're 1.4 billion, we're whatever.
That would require a self-confident leadership in Beijing, and I don't see that taking place during this decade, which Brendan has very much focused on, and I agree with that focus of the next decade. And I don't see it happening as long as Xi Jinping is in power. Now, I have learned to say, never say never, but during this decade, I cannot see a retreat to that, history. Time is on our side now.
Right, Alan, I want to bring the conversation around to Australia at this point, and if we cast our minds back to an era that feels long, long past, which is Alexander Downer's famous remark at a doorstop interview in Shanghai in August of 2004, when prodded by, I've just gone blank on the journalist, about a perspective...
Hamish MacDonald.
Hamish MacDonald, thank you. When asked by Hamish MacDonald about the prospects of a conflict over Taiwan, Downer famously said, well, if that happened, ANZUS wouldn't necessarily apply, and all hell broke loose for a whole range of reasons. Because for a range of reasons to do with the alliance, the shadow of the Iraq War, and all sorts of contextual moments, but also sort of it was a useful prompt for us to think about how we relate to this region and the fissures and fault lines that are there, and the fact that was beginning to emerge in that point in time that actually there's this big thing called China with whom we have enormous economic relations, and there's this security relationship we've got with the US that may not actually be as aligned as they once were. What do you think are the implications of the scenarios that Brendan's laid out for Australia today? Because we're much closer, I think, as Brendan's described, to that hypothetical moment that prompted Downer's remarks in 2004 than we were then.
Yeah, well, look, first thing, like Linda, is to say that I think Brendan's done a terrific service to everyone here by puncturing the sort of dangerous insouciance which seems to me to pervade much of the China debate or China loud shouting in Australia at the moment, because he's pointed out that really bad things can happen. They can happen quite quickly, and we should be focusing attention on them. So in stopping us from averting our eyes from the consequences of some of the things going on in both the Taiwan Straits and elsewhere, as you point out in four flashpoints, that's a terrific thing. Downer, yes, it did seem like a different age, didn't it? 2004. He was factually correct, of course. He was simply noting that the ANZUS treaty doesn't require automatic responses from Australia. He was politically stupid in calling the treaty symbolic, which was what actually brought a lot of the fire and fury raining down upon him. But more interesting, I thought, was the context in which he was saying this. He was saying he answered this question in a press conference in which he was also talking about how things had changed in the Australia-China relationship. There was real value now in our working together more closely with China, on politics and strategic and security issues in the region. That now no longer seems plausible. So, what does what should Australia do now? Well, one of the things that's changed, I suspect, is domestic attitudes in Australia to this. At about the time that Downer was making his speech, we were doing the first Lowy poll.
Yes.
And I was present. We did a focus group to test the questions, and I'd never seen this before, but I was sitting behind a screen looking at ordinary Sydney suburbanites talking about the state of the world, and the question of Taiwan came up then. If China attacked Taiwan and America responded, should Australia go to their assistance? And the people in the room all said, no, I don't think so. And so the interviewer doing the said, but you do realise that we have an alliance relationship, with the United States. This is the ANZUS alliance. They said, oh. And then one of them said, well, we should go, but we should sail very slowly.
Hire that person.
But as we've seen from the Lowy poll, 2019, attitudes to China and to security in the region have changed a lot. Although, interestingly, on precisely the same question, should Australia get involved if China invades Taiwan and the US decides to intervene, only 43% of respondents in the poll this year said yes, despite the general sort of suspicion or growing suspicion of China.
So is the sense, though, I mean, if we step back from it also and think about the context of the kinds of scenarios that Brendan lays out, as Linda was saying, if you think less about the specific spark and the steps that lead up to it, is, Australia's positioning in relation, for example, to Taiwan, to China, where after Prime Minister Morrison's recent speech, we've sort of strapped ourselves to the mast of the Trumpian approach to China. How should Australia begin to position itself, given the likelihood of something getting really complex across the Taiwan Straits?
Well, I'm delighted you think there's a Trumpian mast on China, or that Morrison has strapped himself to it. I don't think either of those. Well, if Trump has a China strategy, it's obscure to me. I have to say, and I think the Prime Minister is actually, despite negative globalism and all the things in the Lowy speech that were Trump-like in tone, I think on China, the government's position has remained very careful in all it's said. So I think we should stay calm. I love the fact that Brendan quotes Lawrence Friedman, who's one of the wisest people I know, as saying strategy is getting to the next stage rather than the ultimate destination. And so I think that's right. We need to plan, we need to talk, we need to do all the things that you were talking about before, both of you, in trying to work out with others how we can best encourage the development of processes that will at least put speed bumps in the way of conflict.
So Hugh, as Canberra's resident pessimist,
Guilty, yes.
I was wondering, firstly, do you agree with Brendan's assessment, or are you yet gloomier about the prospects of conflict over Taiwan over the next 10 years?
Yes. Well, first, to join the others in saying that I really think it's a terrific book, and I really think Brendan has done us a great service, and it's really good to see, particularly in this very prestigious series, the Adelphi Papers. It's great to see that argument presented, and it's great to see it presented with an Australian voice. Look, I am as gloomy as Brendan, or maybe just a shade gloomier,
Astonishing.
predictably enough. And I think it's because of the evolving attitudes of the three key players. I very much agree with Brendan's basic analysis of that, but it seems to me that if we look at two of those three players, their position is clear, and we look at the third, their position is very unclear, and that's where a lot of the danger lies. China, it's clear that its advantages vis-a-vis the US and Taiwan are growing, and that it's impatient and its patience is dwindling. And it's impatient not just, I think, to reunify, as they would see, the homeland, but also, I think, impatient to assert its position as the primary strategic power in East Asia. And I do think that for China, what makes Taiwan important is not just Taiwan itself, but what Taiwan means and the way the Taiwan issue evolves for China's claim to be the primary power in East Asia. So I think China is becoming more impatient about both of those. The second thing that's clear is Taiwan. I very much buy the argument that Brendan's articulated, that whereas a decade ago it was possible to understand Beijing's confidence that in the grand sweep of history things were moving China's way in Taiwan, it's now very hard to be optimistic that Taiwan is drifting towards that. It's less and less likely to accept unification on China's terms. And those two very clear, I think very well entrenched trends increase the danger significantly. The third element, in a sense the point that makes the danger really great, is America. Its advantages, in particular its military advantages, as Brendan sets out very clearly, are dwindling. That means, in theory, that it's more easily deterred from supporting Taiwan. It certainly means that China is more likely to believe that it is more easily deterred from supporting Taiwan, which therefore removes the restraints or lowers the restraints on Beijing. The question is the United States less resolved now or not? And there the data is very unclear. I absolutely agree with Alan. I mean, just to put it in very simplistic terms, you get all the tough talk out of Washington about a new Cold War, and then you get Donald Trump in London. You know, I mean, what are we to make of this country's resolve to pay the price, take the risks and bear the burdens that would be involved in successfully confronting China over Taiwan? Now, the big danger is that China will underestimate America's resolve, and it will push Taiwan harder to the point where the United States has to make that big choice between stepping back from Asia and stepping forward into a confrontation with China, and the Chinese get it wrong and the Americans step forward into the confrontation. If war happens, it will be because China underestimates America's resolve. If a clash is to be avoided over the next decade, it will be because the United States does back off. Now, my own analysis, if this counts as optimism, is that the United States is more likely to back off, because in the end, I think all the tough guys in Washington don't really speak for America, and weirdly enough, Donald Trump does. I don't think the United States as a whole is really committed to this. But, and I think, although Brendan was too cautious to say this, I think the implication, I think, of the argument he presents is that in the end, the United States can't defend Taiwan. And if it can't defend Taiwan, it's better off backing off. But it, of course, when I say that's only guarded optimism, because that does destroy America's position in Asia. And so the consequences, we don't want to underestimate the consequences of avoiding this conflict that way.
On the question of American credibility, one of the things that really strikes me when I talk to Americans or in the region to others is a very significant gap between America's perception of itself, its role in the region, and its credibility,
yes,
and everyone else's.
Yes.
How big a problem is that?
Well, look, I think it's an immense problem, and I think it's not so much a problem between America and the rest of us, although that's there. It's a problem within the US system, because if you go to what you might call the strategic element of the US, or the military element of the US conversation, it's very clearly understood that the military options the United States had available to itself, for example, in 1996, to run a relatively low-cost, relatively low-risk campaign against China in defence of Taiwan that would had a high chance of delivering a good outcome for America, something that looked like a victory within a few weeks. Those military options, which were there in 1996, are gone. And I don't think anyone in the US strategic community really believes that they're there anymore. And yet, American high-level political conversations still proceed on the basis that military option is there. And the risk is that, where do those two conversations come together? They come together in the Situation Room at 3 o'clock in the morning, where a president says, damn it, we have to go in and really show those Chinese what's what. What can we do, Mr. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff? And the chairman clears his throat, we hope, and says, well, it's a little bit difficult because it's not 1996 anymore. And I think Brendan, lays this out really, really well in his chapter. So, this is a high level of strategic confusion. And, I don't want to draw too much on the historical analogies. I'm not going to go back as far as Brendan to the Peloponnesian Wars, though I think his analogy there is absolutely apt. But if you look at what happened in 1914, everybody underestimated everybody's resolve, and they all got it wrong. So that's why I say if a war happens, it will be because America pushes into a conflict that it can't really win because it believes that the Chinese will back off, and the Chinese won't back off.
So let's, one last thing before we open it to the floor, to be, grab a hold of a little toehold of optimism, and that is the prospects of the US and potentially its allies seeing the futility of conflict over Taiwan.
Yeah.
What is the prospects or possibilities of Taiwan becoming the focal point of a new grand bargain?
Yeah. No, it's a really good question. And I love grand bargains. I wrote a book about it, about the idea that the US and China could do a deal over the future, their respective future roles in Asia, in which Taiwan would play a central role. And I didn't predict it. I just proposed it. I always thought it was a long shot. But in 2012, I thought it was a long shot. In 2019, I think it's a much longer shot. It's not to say I don't think it's desirable. And although I share Alan's respect for Laurie Friedman, I don't think it's just about, managing through. The aim is not to get to the next step. The aim is to avoid getting to the next step. And, it goes actually to the point that Brendan also quotes in that last paragraph of the book from McNamara, that, these days there's no strategy, there's just crisis management. It's not true, actually. What you have to do is to try and reframe. You never end the game. It's like a game of Go. It goes on forever. But you can rearrange the board sometimes. So it would be perfectly possible, in theory, to rearrange the board for the United States and China to remove from the Taiwan situation what I see as the primary supervening problem, and that is the contest between the United States and China over which of them is a dominant power in Asia. And what makes Taiwan so dangerous is it is the principal testing point for their competing claims for primacy in East Asia. So they can remove that by doing a deal over that. But the question we've got to ask, and it's theoretically possible to do the deal. The question is always, what are the terms of the deal? And back in 2012, for example, when I looked at this issue in writing the China choice, I thought the United States would have to at least concede to China that it would accept eventual, peaceful, consensual unification, and that the Chinese might accept that. In other words, the Chinese in return would abandon their claimed right to use military force. But that was in 2012. In 2019, the distribution of power has shifted. We couldn't do as good a deal now with the Chinese. So I think in the end, if there is a deal to be done between the United States and China, it means relinquishing Taiwan.
Linda, you just wanted to quickly weigh in.
I very much agree with what you said before you spoke about the possibility of a deal, and that the mainland is not going to back down.
Yeah.
I mean, their resolve we shouldn't question. We've been talking a lot about the US resolve here.
Yeah.
But no one has mentioned the Taiwanese resolve, which I think is a very important element in the book. And I'd like to ask Brendan, so what will be in the next decade, 5, 6, 7 years, which I see as really the crucial time for Xi Jinping to make a move, What do you envision, having watched what's gone on in Hong Kong, which has surprised us, the resolve of the Hong Kongese people? What could you imagine would be the Taiwanese resolve?
I mean, the evidence is pretty mixed on this. I mean, as you would know from your own work, that there is a lot of speculation that Taiwan's younger generation is, often referred to in very derogatory terms as the strawberry generation, in terms of being very, very beautiful, but very bruised and fragile. And I mean, having said that, though, if you look at the public opinion polling, I think some of these trends on Taiwan's identity and on things like, I mean, as you would know very well, Linda, there's literally hundreds of polls run in Taiwan on these polls about will to fight, that exclusive Taiwan identity, resistance to unification. Those trends are pretty strong across the board, but they're even stronger amongst the younger generation. So, for instance, once again, for very, very understandable reasons, Taiwanese under if you look at Taiwanese under the age of 29, 100% view themselves as being exclusively Taiwanese. In the under 40s, 70% of that demographic say they would be willing to fight to defend Taiwan in the case of a Chinese annexation. So, I mean, there is a bit of mixed evidence, but I think the Hong Kong case is quite interesting and instructive for us. And I mean, I think your observations about that there's thinking going on now on the mainland about that resistance and potential resilience on the island is something that's very interesting too.
All right, we've got time for sort of 15, 20 minutes of questions from the floor. There's a couple of roving mics on either side. So if you catch my eye, so the gentleman at the back there, if you just, and then I will keep an eye. If you catch my eye now, I'll start drawing up a list and I'll confirm. Let's see.
Hello, David Goyne. Look, this is probably a general question. With the situation in Hong Kong, I can't see a happy outcome from here because at some stage China will want to restore order there. Does this create, how can I put it, a be hanged for a sheep as well as a lamb situation, which lowers the resistance to acting against Taiwan? In other words, if you're going to be isolated from the world because you've intervened in Hong Kong, well, you may as well be isolated for two places at once. Does it increase the risk?
Brendan or Linda want to...
Do you want to have a go at that one?
I don't think it increases or decreases the risk. I think, as you said, there's a very difficult situation in Hong Kong at the moment. It'll take possibly quite a long time for us to see how it plays out. I think it has a big bearing on the Taiwan issue, but I don't think it's going to make them more willing in Beijing or less willing in Beijing to think about the force option. The force option is absolutely front and center in the minds of the mainland leaders if certain scenarios take place, and Brendan has described them well in the book.
Okay, right here at the tie.
Hello. My question is about a dream. That dream is shared by many people across the Taiwan Strait. That is Taiwan's excel in democracy and prosperity. That could show the Chinese people their future way. However, even though this dream is not provocative at all, many Chinese friends are making fun of this. They are saying the so-called like-minded countries won't truly support Taiwan because they only view Taiwan as a minefield or just trying to use it as a pawn. So my question is, are the Chinese friends right, or the so-called like-minded countries can really see that outcome, that dream is also good for the rest of the world, and to truly support Taiwan's democracy and prosperity. Thank you.
Brendan, I think that one's on you.
Yes. It's a very, very difficult question, which is why I'm pausing to think about the answer to it. I think that in terms of the argument about, and it's one of the things I talk about towards the end of the book, what happens beyond the next decade. And one possibility is that we see quite radical political change on the mainland, and we do see a move in that direction. I personally think that at this point in time, that's quite unlikely to occur. But having said that, you'll be very familiar with the history of China. One of the constants in China has been change, and if we look back over the course of Chinese history. So I think that that's certainly something that can't be written off. And I think, in fact, from Taiwan's perspective, I think that's probably the best hope that Taiwan has over the longer term, that does happen. I know Hugh said to me for many years that hope is not a strategy, but I think in Taiwan's case, hope is perhaps a strategy, that there is change on, is probably the best outcome from Taiwan's perspective. Although it's interesting when you look at some of those polls that are taking place. There's even now, as you would know, very, very strong resistance even to reunification, even if China were to become more democratic than it is now. I suppose though the other angle to look at is kind of beneath the surface of these discussions and the debate about the values element to this. I think the values element is an important element to this, but perhaps I'm a little bit more cynical, and I kind of look to some of that language about Taiwan that you used was very reminiscent of the language that Vice President Mike Pence used in his address at the Hudson Institute last year. And there is, this is also without being too crude about it, it is a struggle for power, and to some extent those arguments about values, beneath those kind of values and what we talk about here in Australia about the rules-based order, there is a contest for power and a power-based order that's sitting beneath those. And I think that's an element that shouldn't get lost in all of this as well. So
and there's also the fact, I think, that Taiwan's democratic status means that in the event of a crisis, striking the kind of pragmatic realpolitik in which we go 23 million conflict, 1.3 billion regional order, let's, sorry, Taiwan, you lose on this one. That becomes much harder in a world in which sort of pluralism and values, or sort of values and human rights has got a kind of weight in politics that makes it harder. It's not to say it's deterministic, but I think it's an added complicating factor in these things. Now, John McCarthy's next. Yep.
Thanks. Well, look, thank you very much for that. There's just one question I'd really like to pose to you. We tend to see the Taiwan issue in terms of the United States and China primarily, and also, of course, where we come into it, or where we could come into it. The other country which is, I think, very important in this regard is Japan. And the Japanese watch what's happening in Taiwan minutely. And also, as I think's been alluded to earlier, their policies are changing a bit with China, not only in the East China Sea. Their view on the trade war is a very different one to that of the United States. They are hedging. Xi Jinping is going to Japan. It will be a major visit. So all these things are happening, which seems to suggest that they are looking at Taiwan through a different lens to the United States, not totally. The question I'd like to pose to you is, how do you see their policy on Taiwan developing over the next 10 years, given their different perspectives? although of course they're an ally of the United States and they're huge American military installations and in Japan. But they have a different outlook. And the second question is, to what degree should we be guided to some degree by Japanese perceptions on Taiwan, which, as I repeat again, I think are different to those of the United States?
I'm happy to have a go at that, but others will have a view as well. But no, very, very good questions and interrelated questions. I mean, I think Japan is arguably outside of those, as you've alluded to, outside of those three players, I think is the most important player in this equation. And in fact, in a Taiwan conflict, because of its air and naval assets that it would bring, it could potentially, if a Taiwan conflict happened today, could be a very, very important asset for the United States in that conflict. I think that the Japanese would probably want to do all that they could do to stay out of a conflict. But I think that in the end, if there were a conflict, once again for the reasons you referred to, particularly with the American bases on Okinawa, I think it would be very, very hard for the Japanese to not get dragged into a conflict over Taiwan, particularly if the United States were to get involved. And for that reason, I think in your last point about should Australia be guided by, Japan's perceptions on this? I mean, it's interesting that the relationship between Japan and Taiwan has quietly been getting much closer in recent years. But I think that in many respects, the Japanese face a very, very similar dilemma to the one that we face. I mean, many will disagree with me. I think if there was a conflict over Taiwan, that the kind of the downer debate that was had almost becomes irrelevant. I find it very hard to imagine a situation where if there was a conflict over Taiwan, if the United States became involved, if a request for Australian assistance came, and please feel free to jump in and disagree, but I find it very hard to imagine a situation where Australia would say no to that request. And for that reason, I think it's one of the reasons why I think it's critically important that Australia begins to think now about what can we do to try and head off this possibility. I think the debate about whether ANZUS will apply or not in the case of a Taiwan conflict, I think it's the wrong debate for us to be having. It's a question we very often ask in relation to this flashpoint, but I think if we get to that point, it's already too late for us. So I would like to see the Morrison government being a lot more ambitious in this respect. I think at the moment we're tending to, for understandable reasons, once again, keep a pretty low profile, try and stay out of trouble. But I think that this is an area where, and particularly, as I mentioned, other countries like the Japanese and also the Singaporeans have a lot to lose, and particularly a kind of a full-blown Taiwan conflict that, without wanting to be too alarmist, escalates to the nuclear level. That would, the damage that would do back here, it would literally, as I say in the book, change life as we know it here in Australia for a considerable period of time. So that's where I think that there is an important commonality there where, and I don't think it can be just Australia and Japan because of some of the historical problems in the China-Japan relationship, but where Australia and Japan and maybe one or two others from the region could be doing a lot more to, even if it's a very difficult endeavour to try and head off that possibility.
Anyone else want to?
Can I ask a question? One of the big differences between now and 2004 is the structure of the ADF and the interoperability with the US. So my question to people, you two who know much more about this than me, is could we stay out of? Is that even an option for Australia if conflict breaks out in the Gulf?
In Taiwan, you mean? Yeah.
Sorry, the Strait, not the Gulf. Yeah.
Like everyone, you're stuck in the Middle East.
Yes, we could. It wouldn't be cost-free. It would mean we'd rip a bit of tissue in the process, but we certainly could. And I'd take a slightly different view from Brendan as to whether we would or not. It would depend entirely on the conversation around the table in the cabinet room. Because there will certainly be people around the table who will say, excuse me, this is the United States, we're a US ally, of course we go along with them. But one hopes that at least there'll be people on the other side of the table who'll say, yeah, but are the Americans going to win this one? And how big is it going to get? And what's the risk of it turning into a broadly based, broad regional war? And what's the risk of it going nuclear? And if we're not going to win this one, is it smart to get into it? I think it's not going to be like a decision to go to Iraq or Afghanistan.
So the same questions applied.
Well, quite, and weren't asked and answered. But the downside is much bigger. It's more like a decision to go to war in 1914.
Yeah.
That's a melodramatic thing to say, but I mean it quite literally. And so, so I hope at least that people will not think that the answer is preordained because we're a US ally and therefore we always go along. We ask, where is this going to end? What's it going to achieve? And so I do think the issue is much less clear. And I think, going back to John's point about Japan, I also think it's less clear that Japan signs up. I mean, I think what Japan is doing at the moment, it's an enormously complex question for Japan as it is for us. Their whole conception of their place in Asia depends on their alliance with the United States. But they absolutely understand that the more powerful China becomes, the less reliable the United States is an ally, and the less sense it makes for them to completely their relationship with China to support the United States on an issue which the United States has got a very low chance of winning. The calculus would be different if we all believed the United States had a military strategy which delivered them a high chance of a rapid win. But that's what's changed, and that's the fundamental new factor, which I think your book very aptly brings out.
In fact, I think Japan has got further than in Australia is understood to understanding that they can't only think of this through the US.
Yeah, absolutely.
lens.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Now, I've got about half a dozen questions. We've only got about 10 more minutes or so I'm going to try and get through them quickly. We've got this one here. I'm probably not going to... You'll be at the last. No, sorry, this woman here, and then we've got family here, and then I feel like the air traffic controller at Heathrow. I've got a bar.
So you've been talking about the rest of the world's response to a potential conflict between Taiwan and the PRC. I'm just wondering how you see China's human rights abuses, particularly in Xinjiang against the Uyghurs, as affecting the US or Japan or Australia's strategy on Taiwan, and how we will respond to a potential conflict there.
If I could just, whilst they're thinking, I'll just weigh in with it adds a level of political complexity to it all. And one of the things that's been interesting to watch is hard-headed strategic realists all of a sudden discover they're inner human rights activists because of Xinjiang. And I think that's how it's going to play just as a first take, which is it becomes part of the push and pull of how you mobilise support on all angles. So whether if you're certainly in Taiwan, that is a card you're going to be playing very hard if you're trying to win support and build coalitions to support you. But that's just my sort of first quick take. My more learned scholarly colleagues have now had some time to think it through.
I'd definitely say that if the PRC, when Xi Jinping came to power, had become less repressive, and we wouldn't be looking at not only the human rights abuses in Xinjiang, but repression across the board in mainland Chinese society, it would certainly help the mainland's case because it wouldn't take away from the nationalist streak, the absolute insistence that Taiwan is part of one China, and the insistence that Taiwan at some point has to be taken back into the fold. It's made it, like Nick said, more complex, but certainly stack the cards against mainland China.
I mean, it's a really important question. I agree with Nick. In the first instance, the nature of China's government and the trajectory of China's government under Xi Jinping and the very significant concerns about that would do make it harder. But it's very important to remember what's on the other side of the scale. It's a war which is very likely to be bigger than any war since the Second World War. And it's a measurable chance of going nuclear. I mean, nothing is more important than understand. This is one of the great strengths of Brendan's book. Nothing is more important than understanding what the risks look like on that side. If in 10 years' time there's been a nuclear war which has killed 20 million people, and that's not a fanciful figure. We will ask ourselves those of us who are still alive will ask ourselves, what didn't we do to avoid that? How did we allow that to happen? And significant, and this is, a point where it's, this is very Weberian, this is, the ethics of consequence. Significant though the bad things that happen in China are, the idea that we would risk a nuclear war with China over them, well, it's a real moral issue with very real moral weight on both sides, and terrible though the things that are happening in Xinjiang are, I wouldn't myself fight a nuclear war to avoid them, or risk a nuclear war to avoid them. It's a very tough question. It's a very tough answer. You've asked a tough question, I've given a tough answer, but I think it's the facts that drive us to that. And it's one of the things that changed when the world discovered nuclear weapons. The stakes are so high now, and it's important to keep remembering how high those stakes are, because the nuclear weapons are still there, and they can go off.
All right, Mr. Munjie.
Hello. Testing.
Yep.
Thank you. Sorry. Thanks, Nick, for the chairmanship of the rest of the panel. Wonderful. I have two comments, probably a very tough comment for you guys. Sam Wong is my name. I'm from the SBS Chinese radio program. Our listener always ask, the National Press Club hold many of this panel about China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, the rest welcoming. But interesting enough, rarely, or haven't seen one, I live here for 50 years, there is a member of the panel come from the Chinese diaspora in Australia. We have now 1.2 million people in here. I don't think 1.2 million, we can't pick one to talk about ourselves in all this panel about our discussion. This is for your consideration, but the folly continue. There are so much things happening in China, in Taiwan, in Hong Kong. We don't have a voice. And that is unfortunate. We don't sell books, for example. We only talk about the truth. And that is something for your consideration for panel. We are all very grateful for your participation, but we have no voice. Either positive or negative, we like to have a voice. And thank you. And the second comment is about Professor Taylor's comment about the absolute support from the young people from Taiwan about the independence. I'll give you a very long but very short story. I visited an outpost in Fujian province, in Fuzhou, a place called Pingtan. In there are 5,000 Taiwanese young people, immigrant, in the past 10 years come over. It's only 2 hours ferry, and I managed to talk with them. Surprisingly, they would rather have the situation in China to give them an opportunity for employment, develop their ideas and freedom. Now, I might talk about nonsense. You think I'm a member of the Chinese Communist Party. I'm not. But I'm saying to you that there are other voice around. It's not just through the political thing. And I suggest all your academic go and talk with the community. Don't just read books and reading gazette notice from governments. Go to talk to the real people and see how we feel. And I'm sorry some of your views I disagree, but it's not a place for me to talk about it. But I respect those views. And therefore, I thank you for the opportunity. Thank you.
No, thank you. I think it's important to remember that there's not just one view on these facts. Now, next question is the gentleman at the back in the grey suit. Yep.
Thank you very much, David Connery and Nick and panel. Thank you very much for a stimulating conversation. Could I return to Dave Goyne's first question about Hong Kong and just flip it over the strait? How are the people of Taiwan, from your analysis, interpreting what's going on in Hong Kong, and what sort of attraction, and taking into mind the previous comment about different kinds of attraction, but how is it being interpreted in Taiwan?
I think, in short, I think it's essentially means the end of the kind of the one country, two systems model in Taiwan, or at least that's always been a model or a framework that's been very unpopular amongst Taiwanese ever since Deng Xiaoping first proposed it. In fact, it's interesting that he proposed it first in relation to Taiwan, and when it didn't reach a very favourable reception there, it was instead applied to the case of Hong Kong. But I think that I mean, certainly that's what the polling once again suggests. And I think, I mean, another good indication of it is the fortunes of the current leader of Taiwan, Tsai Ing-wen, over the last year. I mean, her hopes of being re-elected were really flagging. I mean, even as recently as this time last year, she was well down in the polls. Not so much because of the approach that she'd taken to cross-strait relations, but because of domestic challenges and environmental difficulties and other things within Taiwan itself. But the events in Hong Kong have really led to a surge in her popularity from a situation where even in November of last year, when the opposition party, the Kuomintang, comprehensively won local elections, to a situation now where, I mean, given the events in Australia of this year, we can, never say never, but it's hard to imagine a situation where Tsai Ing-wen doesn't win the forthcoming presidential election in Japan in January 2020. And I think that the developments in Hong Kong and also her response to those, I mean, she's known as someone who's quite a careful, pragmatic person. She's come out very, very quickly in relation or in response to those events, offered asylum for Hong Kongers on Taiwan. Come out very strongly at the beginning of this year when Xi Jinping said that the one country, two systems was China's preferred model for Taiwan, and said that no, that's not going to happen. And this is a view now that's also held across both sides of Taiwanese politics, with the opposition candidate Han Kuo-yu coming out and saying that one country, two systems would be put in place over his dead body. So I think that's been the big implication. Others may have a different view. Linda, particularly keen to hear what you think, but there has always been this connection between Hong Kong and Taiwan, and I think we've seen that once again come to the fore again, particularly in the lead up to the election.
I fully agree. I think Tsai Ing-wen has really utilised in a very skillful manner what has gone on in Hong Kong, and I fully agree also that it would be a miracle if she would lose the election.
You heard it. I'm afraid this one at the back. This one at the back, I'm afraid it was have to be the last. I know there's others who want to weigh in, but given the time, if you could be quick with this one.
Hi, g'day. G'day. Hi. Thank you very much for a fantastic presentation. My question arises from Professor White's comment, but it goes, I guess, to the panel. Correct me if I'm wrong, Professor White, but I think that you said that the best thing would be for the US to step back effectively and cede Taiwan to China. To make, and we've now heard about the costs to the US in terms of maintaining its role in the Western Pacific, in terms of defending Taiwan, and the fact that it can't be assured anymore of a quick, relatively painless deterrence of a Chinese action. My question looks at the Chinese side of that equation as well. The CCP's just celebrated its 70th birthday. It's outlasted the Soviet party in the communists in Russia. It showed that it's, if nothing else, extremely aware of its own survival. It has done its best to perpetuate its rule, and it hasn't done various things.
Could you quickly get to the question?
Downfall. And I'm sorry, I'll get to my question, I guess, which is that surely, if that's the equation from the Western perspective, from the Washington side of things, that this is going to be a terrible conflict and we can't possibly win it, surely that's also the perspective from the Chinese side of the strait, which is that no one expects the Chinese to be able to categorically defeat a US intervention for certainly the next 10 years and for a lot longer after that.
Yeah.
Surely the best course of action would be to maintain doubt in China's mind that there would be a Western withdrawal, allowing them to do what they want with Taiwan. And the second part of that question is, from Australia's perspective, surely we don't want to live in a region where China is able to do whatever it wants simply because it can. And that informs our policy response to whether we should support the US in remaining engaged or not. Long-winded question, but thank you very much.
Really good question. So I'll answer the second question first. Absolutely. I would much prefer to live in a region in which the United States remains the primary power and China's power is significantly constrained by a US presence. But the question is not what I want. The question is what we can prudently, sensibly hope to get to. And although I'd prefer that outcome, I'm not sure I prefer it enough to be willing to risk a US-China conflict in order to achieve it, particularly because I'm not sure the United States would win that US-China conflict. It's not necessarily that it would lose it, but what does winning a war with China mean? You know, it's a very serious question. How do you end that war? And what does the region look like when it's over? And so this is not a question about what I want. It's a question about what we should prudently expect, what the real options available to us are. And in answer to your first question, I mean, just to clarify, the US withdrawal is the best and surest way to avoid a conflict over Taiwan. But it has, for the reasons I've just expressed, terrible implications for the kind of region we live in. I think it's very likely to lead us to a region in which, in East Asia at least, China does emerge as the primary power. Now, there's a long argument as to why I think that, which I won't bother you with now, but I think that's the most likely outcome. And that is a region which is much harder for Australia to live in than the region we've known. So it's not a desirable outcome. It's just less undesirable than the outcome, than the region in which continued and escalating strategic rivalry between the US and China increases the risk of a major conflict which has a high chance of becoming a nuclear conflict. Now, you're right to say that one way to avoid that is to maintain a stable balance of deterrence in which the Chinese are deterred from military action against Taiwan by the sure and certain knowledge that the United States would in fact fight back. That is, for example, what kept the Cold War cold, what made the Cold War such a distinctive event in strategic history. And the reason why the war never turned into a hot war was that both sides were persuaded that the other was so resolved to preserve their position that they would be willing to fight a full-scale war, including a nuclear war, including a major exchange targeting one another's cities, in order to preserve the status quo on the Central Front. And the question is, can the US persuade China of that today? And my argument is that it can't without a huge effort, incomparably bigger effort than the one they're making at the moment. At the height of the Cold War, the United States was spending 10% of GDP on defence and was consciously accepting, explaining to its citizens that they had to accept the risk of destruction of their major cities in order to defend Berlin. The question is, and it's a little party trick, you go to Washington and go to a conference room in the Pentagon, or you go to one of the think tanks on Massachusetts Avenue and say, I know about the Taiwan Relations Act, but just tell me, are you really willing, in Xiong Wang-kai's famous phrase, to lose Los Angeles to defend Taipei? And they don't say yes. But if you ask them during the Cold War, were you really willing to lose New York to save Berlin? Yes, they said, absolutely. And we've got the force and the military doctrine to prove it. Now, it's possible that the United States could maintain that level of deterrence, but it would have to undertake an effort which makes the new Cold War with China a real Cold War, just like the last one. And it's not just when I look at Donald Trump that I think that's not the America we have today. It's when I look at Barack Obama or Elizabeth Warren or Joe Biden or Pete Buttigieg. It would be possible, but I don't think that's what we're going to get. Therefore, it's dumb for us to keep on assuming, to base our policy on the expectation that we're dealing with an America which is not there.
And if you look at the structural budget deficit in the United States, it probably isn't financially possible either.
Well,
but anyway, that's it. We have to stop there.
Yeah.
Stop there.
Sorry, my favourite topic.
No. You open the Taiwan can with you, and this is what you can. So before we end, I'd like to take this moment to mark the formal time when this book is launched in Australia, so we can all give a huge cheer. It is on sale there immediately afterwards. Brendan will happily sign multiple copies, and if you look at the dimensions, you'll see that it is perfectly shaped to fit inside a stocking. So for the Asian security wonk in your household or extended family, this is the perfect stocking stuffer. On behalf of the panel, I'd like to extend our thanks to everyone at China Matters and at the Coral Bell School for making this evening happen, particularly Michelle Ferreira, who corralled the team and ensured everything went so smoothly, and of course, thank the staff here at the National Press Club. There are drinks available still, I think, out the front, and we'd love you to stay and enjoy them with us. And finally, to thank you all for coming on a rather peculiar weather event in Canberra, where it was hot and windy and a westerly, which I haven't seen before. So thank you and good evening.